in the Hebrew. It is the word matan in the Hebrew. It is a gift, and I will give it. Whatever you say to me, I will give. Only give me the woman to be my wife. Now this love gift, or this matan, was actually gifts that were given by the prospective groom to the bride. And these gifts were an expression of his love and desire and affection for that bride-to-be. These gifts usually amounted to very expensive things. You recall in the passage that we looked at just a moment ago in Genesis 24 that when Eleazar brought out these gifts, the servant brought out jewelry. This is in addition to the bride price that he's paid to Laban for the hand of Rebekah. The servant brought out jewelry of silver and of gold and garments and gave them to who? Gave them to Rebekah. Now these gifts, these love gifts that were exchanged between the prospective groom and his bride consisted oftentimes of very expensive jewelry. And then of course this tells us here that he also gave her fine expensive garments. Now that's very interesting because the giving of this jewelry or this expensive jewelry, oftentimes it was in the form of a very expensive ring or some other type of jewelry. We still practice this today, do we not? Engagement rings are usually pretty expensive, right guys? Okay? But what did that represent? That represented a deposit by the groom with the bride that was a guarantee. It was a guarantee that the bridegroom was going to come back for his bride. It was an assurance for her, a guarantee for her. And then he would often give her very fine garments, which usually consisted of garments that were made up of fine, pure white linen. And these brides would often, on the day of their wedding, they would wear this fine, beautiful, white linen garment that was given to them by their bridegroom. These things are going to be beautiful when we get over into the New Testament. They're actually very romantic right now, though, aren't they? What about it, girls? What do you think? Okay? So we see that these garments and this jewelry were given to guarantee the return of this groom and to give this bride a beautiful wedding dress that she could wear on the day of their union. And of course we know even still today that we practice the wearing of white apparel at a wedding to signify what? The purity of the bride. So, these love gifts or these matan were given to the bride by the groom. They signified his affection for her. They served as a deposit or a guarantee that he would return to claim his bride. And they usually included a garment of fine, pure, white linen to be worn by the bride on the day of her wedding. But even in addition to this, there was a lot of gifts exchanging when these betrothals and marriages would take place. In addition to the matan or the love gifts, there was the shiluim, or the dowry. Now, among ancient people, the dowry was commonly conceived of as a daughter's share of her father's inheritance. It was, if you will, a kind of a blessing by the father to the daughter, a gift from the father to the daughter that would prepare her. Look at this passage. Look at this passage in Judges chapter 1 verse 15 when Othniel wanted to marry the daughter of Caleb, Aksash. Achash comes to Caleb, her father, and says, "Give me a blessing, since you have set me in the land of Negeb. Give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. He gave her a plot of land on which there were 2 sets of springs. He gave her a gift of land. And this was a dowry, if you will. The shiluhim was the dowry that was given by the father of the bride to the bride herself. And the purpose of this was to pronounce his blessing on the union, but it was also to begin to equip her for her new life as a bride. You need to hang on to these concepts for an entire week, because they're going to become quite significant next week as we look into the New Testament. Next, there was the ketubah. The ketubah, which was the marriage contract. It was a legally formalized written marriage contract. When the 2 parties would come together, there would be a written contract that would be made between the bride and the groom. It was called a ketubah, and it stated within this document the bride price that was paid for the bride was stated. The promises of the groom to the bride as to his provision for her and his protection of her were stated within this contract. And the privileges of the bride, as she was to become the wife of the bridegroom, the privileges that she was to enjoy as the bride were stated within this contract. Interestingly enough, this written contract was referred to as a covenant. Ding, ding. It was referred to as a covenant or a testament, documenting this sacred union that was about to be entered into. And this marriage document, this marriage contract, this covenant was entered into at the beginning of their engagement or their betrothal. And it was of such a binding nature that it could not be broken except in one case. And that was in the case of infidelity by one party or the other. But so binding was their engagement and their betrothal that their betrothal was under contract. It was under a covenant agreement and could not be broken. So we see that the marriage contract was considered a sacred and a binding covenant or testament between the bride and her groom that could not be broken unless one or the other was guilty of infidelity. All of these things were components of this union that was about to take place. And all of these things would take place in a betrothal ceremony, if you will, called the kiddushin. The kiddushin, or the betrothal. And Jewish betrothal was much, much, much more formal than our custom of engagement. When they entered into this engagement or this betrothal period, this was not a test period or a trial period to see if they were compatible. This was a covenanting together that they would be bound together in the marriage union, and nothing short of infidelity could break that contract or that covenant. And this betrothal was very ceremonial. And this is so beautiful, guys. Follow me very closely here over the next few minutes as we wrap this up. The bridegroom and his father and their family would proceed to the home of the bride-to-be. The two families would sit down together. The bride price would be hammered out. The stipulations of the marriage covenant would be hammered out until both parties fully and completely agreed to all that was taking place. Then there was a very formal ceremony that took place. And it was called the tradition, get this, of the cup of acceptance. The tradition of the cup of acceptance. Once the terms of the marriage